And welcome back, everyone. It's great to be joining you for the end of what I hear has been an amazing day at the Dime Conference. My name is Bridget White. I'm the Chief Exec of Music Mark, and I'm delighted to be welcoming our keynote speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Mat Dalgleish. I'm really looking forward to this session. I love the description that was given to this session, a more considered and reflective innovation process. And I really like the idea of slow culture and frugal innovation. Mat, it's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time today. And I will leave you to give our keynote speech, and I will be back to help with a Q&A a bit later. So over to you, Mat. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully that will be there in one moment. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Mat Dalgleish, and I currently work at Staffordshire University, where I'm a senior lecturer in game audio and technical design. I've only been there about a year. Before that, I was postgrad subject director for the performing arts, musical theatre, and the MMUS course at the University of Wolverhampton. I spent a lot of my time there developing quite a distinctive music technology provision, although I also taught into the music courses as well. Before that, I was a visiting researcher at the Open University Music Computing Lab, and I did a kettle, which is a kind of educational institute funded PhD. And going back further still, I have a visual arts background, although I played instruments. My undergrad and master's degrees were in the visual arts and digital media. I've got particular interests in digital musical instrument design and interface design, which I'll really use as a lens for talking about a range of things today. And I've also got interests in music for film, synthesis, and procedural audio. Today, I'm going to talk about the idea of slowness as being productive within music technology, essentially, and having benefits in terms of sustainability, frugality, maybe productivity as well. And my talk is going to have really 3 or 4 smaller parts. I'll start by giving you some context in which my work sits, and then we'll look at how my early work intersects with that and how my work changed over time. We'll look at how exposure to contemporary research led me to develop slower approaches, and I'll give you some examples from my own practice as well as examples from others. If you want to download these slides, there's really quite an extensive bibliography if you're interested in any of these things. Do make use of it if it's at all relevant to you. Okay, so I'll start with a bit of context, and if we think of how old the oldest known musical instruments are, about 50,000 years or so, we see them as evolving very slowly over hundreds or thousands of years, but because their designs have stagnated by the late 18th century, we get the somewhat misleading impression of them being optimal or idealized or balanced. And rather than balanced designs, really they are fundamentally imbalanced. They emerged primarily for acoustical rather than human reasons of sound projection over comfort, ease of use, and so on. And of course, this has some advantages or things that have come to be particular strengths, that the effort required to play these instruments is closely related to expression, as Joel Ryan has noted, and overcoming the challenges or the difficulties imposed by these instruments can be extremely rewarding as a performer, and it can give you a lifetime of rich engagement, which we know from there being many examples of extreme virtuosity. I won't try and name any particular musicians, as that's always controversial. At the same time, from another angle, we get the demands in terms of strength, dexterity, cognition, and so on being made by traditional instruments, inevitably excluding some individuals or significantly worsening their experience to the point that they might give up or perhaps not even really start. And to add to this, we've got a social aspect, by which I mean instrument responses are usually entirely predictable and repeatable. It's part of the essence of traditional instruments. And therefore, perfection has come to be seen as a sign of performance attainment, whereby errors are attributed to performers. We not only provide significant challenges, but we also think badly of performers making mistakes. These properties, these characteristics of acoustic instruments come from the unique connection between the performance interface and the sound generation mechanism, at least in part. We have to choose the performance interface with the sound generation mechanism in mind. The two have to have a physical connection, and these mutually compatible choices largely determine both the form and the properties of the instrument. As a result of the close connection between these two ends of the instrument, as a secondary effect, we get significant haptic feedback being passed from the sound generation mechanism through the performance interface back to the player. This becomes a primary means of navigation for more experienced players, and it also feeds what Robilo calls performer-instrument intimacy, the sense of tactile attachment that people get in relation to their instrument. Fast forward to about 120 years ago, and after the industrialization of electricity, we see a spate of electronic instruments. They're often very innovative in terms of sound generation, but far less innovative in most cases in terms of the performance interface. And so, although we have the instrument as a series of components which could be separated now, really, these early electronic instruments are maintaining many of the properties of acoustic instruments, or trying to. They're clinging to being single, indivisible objects. But we're not really taking advantage of the possibilities of electronic instruments fully. Post-war, the electronic music studio flourishes. Paris, Cologne, Milan, Tokyo, as well as the United States. And the electronic music studio kind of expands and makes explicit the idea of a musical system that can be connected in multiple combinations. And it gives us control over almost every parameter we can imagine at the expense of speed, labor, and financial expense. These things are enormously expensive and therefore available to only a few individuals, usually based at institutions. So we get some reactions against the electronic music studio. The modular synthesizer, still relatively expensive, but a little bit more affordable, and a little bit more portable. And also the live electronics of people like David Tudor, Gordon Mummer, Alvin Lucier, David Berman. And if this idea of the instrument as a series of near discrete components which can be designed separately and rearranged is apparent in modular synthesizers like this prototype Moog modular from 1964, it becomes explicit in the work of David Tudor. And with the separation of the instrument's elements, first across the tabletop and then into architectural space, it becomes possible to design, connect, and make use of any kind of performance interface with almost any kind of sound generation. The two can be designed and created independently of each other and joined afterwards. And this brings the possibility of designing instruments around the body or around individual needs as a primary concern. So this is quite important for me. This is perhaps the most significant shift. The same model of this kind of separated instrument is really reinforced with the design of the MIDI protocol and the possibilities of MIDI for designing just the interface for individual needs is exploited by a modest but important group of composer designers. David Rockaby, Rolf Gelhar, Michel Weiswitz, and Letitia Tsunami. These instruments being shaped around the body also notably no longer look like traditional instruments. They also increasingly embrace the programmability of the digital, enabling presets to be stored, but also different topologies to be tried out on the same hardware. Within a couple of decades, maybe 15 years of this kind of new instruments work, the community has grown and becomes formalized with the founding of the New Interfaces for Musical Expression conference series, the NIME conferences. And NIME starts as a workshop at a human-computer interaction conference in Seattle, but then becomes a separate event held annually at a different location around the world, and becomes a single unified platform for the presentation and discussion of new instruments and interfaces. Primarily new designs, but we also see the appearance of augmented and adapted traditional instruments, sound installations, and so on. And it's really at this point where this community starts to intersect with my own work and my own kind of experiences. So to jump across to my background now. So I grew up just outside Birmingham, maybe about 10 or 11 miles from the centre of Birmingham. I was born without a left arm below the elbow, and I also have some significant lower limb sort of mobility related issues. And from an early age, I wanted to play an instrument, and the trumpet was suggested as being an instrument that would be quite well suited to me. And so aged 6 or so, I started weekly music lessons. I joined the regional brass bands, the school orchestra, and so on. But aged 12, I decided I also wanted to play guitar, and almost no one thought that playing guitar one-handed would be a good idea. But I put so much time into it that I quickly became quite adept at it. But the big difference for me was in the reception, playing the two instruments in public. The guitar was perceived as a much more controversial thing for me to play than the trumpet, and this stuck with me ever since. And that sort of cultural aspect of design has really become a feature of my work ever since. So I continued playing the trumpet until the end of secondary school, and the guitar I still play today. But I went and studied sculpture at Northumbria rather than take up a conservatoire offer on the trumpet. And I did this really, I was very interested in art history, music history, and also in making things into sort of tangible artifacts. And I started to make sound installations, which really driven by necessity were largely constructed from found, obsolete, and therefore free materials. So things like this tape loop, which spans a distance of about 120 feet. Sound is from the room is recorded at one end. It takes a couple of minutes to traverse this complex loop and is then played back at the other. I hadn't yet experienced any kind of programming or any kind of concerted notion of design, but the sculpture department effectively closed at Northumbria University, where I was based, and I transferred to Coventry University, which had Rolf Gelhar there, as well as the likes of Daryl Giorgio, and I became exposed to Things like this Troika Ranch workshop. Troika Ranch are an American dance company who also produce their own software and hardware as a means of realizing their performances. Completely independent, slow software. And so I learned to program really as a way of extending the kinds of things I was making, being able to create more complex behaviors. And I had essentially one-to-one teaching from Rolf Gelhar for about a year. And around this time, Rolf was creating headspace for the trumpeter Clarence Adu, who had been paralyzed in a car accident. Rolf created this new instrument for Clarence, and Clarence had gone away to practice with it, came back having practiced for months and months, and had become quite adept at playing this thing. But it was the comment that it made him feel like a real musician again that seemed quite profound to me, and that, perhaps more than anything else, shaped the direction I wanted to go in. So for all the variety of work I've done since, there's been a sort of underpinning of accessibility throughout in various ways. Around the same time as this, I undertake my first external project, which is in Dresden, and the structure is pre-existing, and I'm there to create a musical topology for this interactive system, essentially. And the ones which were there, I found a little bit simplistic and unsatisfying. So I introduced some chants into my compositions and had the idea of tracking mastery as people got more accurate in their movements, of making this particular topology respond differently to when you just started. But really this idea of a new instrument as a platform for trying out different things, the cost of experimenting in software being low, was something that I took away from this project. And at this time, I'm starting a PhD in instrument design funded by Kettle. And I'm also working about 1 day a week on a variety of external projects. And this project is probably my least favorite that I've ever undertaken, but it really guided the direction that I went in. It started out having quite interesting interaction, but that was gradually stripped back by committee decisions to make it simpler and simpler and simpler until the interaction was just turning on and off the steps within an 8x8 step sequencer, which for me wasn't very interesting. And I started to embrace unpredictability of more complex systems, have more focus on listening and create instruments that enabled that, and generally rethought what the implications of these kinds of unpredictable systems might be for virtuosity and accessibility. If things can't be played in a traditional way, a conventional way, might these new ways of playing open up things to new players, essentially? The first test bed for some of these ideas was a collaborative project with Raiko Goto and Tim Collins, looking at really changing perceptions around trees, changing perception of trees as sort of static and non-sentient things to systems which respond in real time to breath, to pollution, and using sonification of sensor data to try and achieve this. For me, I found the unpredictability I've been craving in the tree itself and its responses. You could broadly guess the behavior, but the details were always surprising. The tree was this kind of non-linear thing as part of this musical system. Using a bit of an error. And I tried to take these ideas across into my own practice. So at the time, I may have been the only person developing new instruments with a similar upper limb disability. And as part of this, I was still making instruments for myself as well as others. And I wanted to make an instrument which explored the possibility of slowing down, of taking some aspects of performance outside of real time, to reduce the physical demands and enable kind of more thinking and more listening during the performance itself. Vanishing Point was based on a single webcam which would capture movement, but in slices, which were then amalgamated over periods of 10, 20, 30 seconds. The result we can see on screen um, is analysed as it scrolls from right to left and used to control granular synthesis. So there's an element of basic control, but the finer details are less predictable. There's lots of variation there and the potential to surprise. I'm still very interested in the tangible, the physical, and my work at the same time is really taking these ideas of generative systems across into a physical form. So the servo string was perhaps the most important piece that I developed as part of my PhD, working with Rolf Gelhar to create something which was an open design. It could be easily repaired, easily reproduced, would fold up and be easily transportable. I don't underestimate the physical demands of lugging a huge thing around, and so we wanted to make this very lightweight. And we knew who our eventual players were going to be. So we designed a system whereby very small movements are surveyed with 2 ultrasonic rangefinders, and the sensor data manipulates a generative algorithm, affects the pitch distribution and density of this algorithm, which is then actuated by some simple robotics which pluck and fret a long string, which we can see below. But it's the first time that I'd really thought about sort of do-it-yourself materials, repairability. These things lasted an awful long time. I took up a post at the Open University, not expecting it to particularly relate to my own practice. I worked on something called Whole Body Harmony Space, which sought to reimagine the learning of music harmony as a series of physical trajectories through the harmony space we can see on screen. But I discovered a second project that I was able to work on had quite similar aims to my own practice, and this became quite a long-running project and quite a productive project. And it initially started as a system for teaching multi-limb rhythms and trying to do so in a way that guided which limb should go where using a series of wearable haptic devices. But it became apparent during the pilot study for this that there were applications in health and particularly in stroke rehabilitation in relation to gait and stabilizing and extending gait. So that secondary purpose was flipped around and became the primary purpose of the systems, and really sort of fitted in with this idea of assistive technologies that have become a significant part of my practice. One of the features of this work at the Open University was an emphasis not only on collaboration with people from mutually beneficial areas, but also on sustainability of using open source tools and software and hardware, so that designs could be freely tweaked, freely archived, and then brought back to life if needed. This led into later work in injury prevention, and violinists, and beginner trumpeters. So this is kind of happening in parallel to my own practice. And the thing I noticed about this work was that it was really at odds with what was going on within the NIME scene, the New Interfaces for Musical Expression community at the time. We were testing these developments at the Open University in longitudinal studies. So the same people coming back every week or every couple of weeks, and we see how they progress over a long time, for instance. Whereas the NIME scene was very much, the NIME community was very much about churning out new instruments. A new thing comes out, another new thing comes out. There was little sense of considering deeply what had been made. And the strange thing for me was that given that we have the potential to create instruments and interfaces, etc., around individual bodies and individual needs, without any impact on the kinds of sounds we might want to make or the performance behaviors we might want to have, there were still relatively few examples of long-term new instruments, new interfaces use, especially by disabled players. I felt quite alone as someone who both designed and played instruments, new instruments, whilst having an upper limb disability, for instance. In terms of the reasons for that, I think we can identify a range of things. But part of the sort of relentless drive for novelty, for new things, is really built into the NIME community. And various authors have more recently suggested that this is not particularly helpful, giving and promoting cutting edge technologies we don't really know the impact of because we've not tested them, and favouring those above all else might be harmful. And I think this is a tendency we see in music technology more generally. It's related to so-called gear acquisition syndrome, or GAS, that sort of urge to buy or own new stuff, seeing it as a way to make yourself better or happier, or more musical. And we see that in everything from guitarists to the synthesizer community to people who use software plugins for music production. So I think part of this this drive, this relentless motion for new things is built in, but also, although the NIME community was espousing the benefits, and there was a really broad consensus as to the benefits of participatory design, co-design, if you might like, there were very, very few examples of meaningful involvement of disabled people in new instrument or interface design. So effectively, the community suggested one thing, but in reality was kind of using older methods and not really doing what it was saying. More than these two things, or at least as important as these two things, was the idea that time needs to be taken, that this this sense of speed was counterproductive to things like finding productive matches between players and instruments. Things you need to invest a lot of time in, like testing. It's easier to make something new in terms of the amount of time and resource needed, perhaps, than thoroughly test something which is existing before you move on. There's also been a shortage of expertise, whether that's in design process facilitation or evaluation. And also, until relatively recently, quite a lot of uncertainties around how to do evaluation, how to get productive information out of design evaluation for instrument technologies. And I think that some of these things led me to start to think about slower approaches. taking things more slowly as a way to be more focused and productive. So I was aware of the slow food movement, which had come to prominence in the mid-1980s, and railed against the disappearance of local food traditions in favour of fast food. I'd also become aware of the slow design movement, which was much more focused on sustainability in all of its forms. And I'd been to the Slow Tech exhibition in London, curated by Protein and Henrietta Thompson. So by about 2012, 2013, I was trying to imagine what slower music technology might look like. And for me, as someone who was primarily designing new instruments and interfaces, it meant becoming more frugal, of fully considering what else is already out there. And these things might have existing ecosystems which lend them advantages in terms of price, access, the ability to repair them. They might have already been relatively well tested in some aspects, and so on. Considering the possibilities of incidental fit. By that, I mean, as an example, the way in which the guitar, although it wasn't designed for me or for my particular needs, happens to fulfill those needs very well. And finding examples of incidental fit elsewhere. And also the possibility that some designs are relatively open-ended and lend themselves to adaptation. Not all designs can be easily adapted, but some tried and tested instruments can be suitable for a far wider range of players with relatively modest adaptations. And trying to test these things as much as possible, of going back to the drawing board where testing shows things aren't working. So effectively, I started producing less in terms of the number of outputs to try and produce sort of more impactful outputs and waste less. Only when existing solutions, existing designs were unsuitable or insufficient in some way would I proceed with the development of new designs. And this fits quite nicely with the widely recognized idea of the design funnel, where we start off with lots of ideas and lots of possibilities, and we test as much as possible to whittle them down to the most appropriate, rather than, for instance, coming up with a single idea and sticking with it no matter what, even if it turns out to be not very good in the end. So my process became, much more reflective, much more testing based, and much more about doing things with existing platforms, reusing where possible, and so on. I also thought it would be an interesting experiment to try and apply some ideas from instrument design to other areas. But, for instance, explored sound as a kind of interface, aiming to supplement or replace audio description for theatre, which requires service users to wear headsets, which my research had suggested was found othering in some cases. People wouldn't use the service even if they needed it because they didn't want to appear different to other members of the audience. And I tried to supplement and replace this with ambiently diffused sound design and informational sound. And while this was quite successful, had a series of pilot performances with interviews afterwards, the most significant thing I found was the unexpected social legacy of the project, that bringing people with shared experiences together for the performance. They quite enjoyed the performances, but it led to the meeting of their own accord monthly for some time afterwards, until I couldn't track that involvement anymore. But this was really pleasing and something I hadn't expected to happen, almost like a support group formed. In thinking about the follow-up to this theatre project, I was starting to explore procedural audio embedded in props for theatre when the pandemic hit. And so I took the technological platform that I was using, the Beeler platform, developed for low latency real-time audio processing, and tried to make a project that was pandemic compatible. So I collaborated with Sarah Whitfield on a procedurally generated audio play in a box using the same technology as the embedded audio for props, but creating a version of Maeterlinck's Interior, originally written for toy theatre in 1895, that would be different each time it was played, entirely synthesized, including all voices, and it was hidden within a radio style knob, which had to be kind of turned to find the play in amongst a series of simulated radio stations. And in a small user study, which involved this thing being posted around, it would then record the user engagement. We found some possible signs of more engagement, more extended engagement, people coming back and trying things with the play that perhaps they wouldn't do with more linear media or a performance, as well as this thing having a particularly low carbon dioxide footprint, both from its means of being disseminated and also from the reuse of all the previous materials. In my own practice, I'd had a modular synthesizer for about 10 years, and I primarily used it as a teaching tool. But I became interested in taking this quite large system and paring it down into something that I could perform with. So rather than a large system, which a little bit like an electronic music studio, gives you many, many parameters, of paring it down into a very small system that can be repatched, effectively programmed in lots of different ways, but could be physically navigated with one and to some extent learn the positions of the jacks and so on, learned in a relatively short amount of time. And this system, being sort of endlessly reconfigurable, provided the scope for testing, for trying out quite a lot of different approaches, eventually leading to a series of strategies specifically for one-handed use, things like exploring different mappings, things like taking some demands out of real time via automation, leveraging parts of the body which weren't ordinarily involved where needed, which in turn suggested some new controllers, which were in turn quite easy to design because of the standardized control voltage protocol, and ultimately distributing responsibilities between myself and other players. So for the first time, at least in an entirely electronic group, playing as a duo and as a trio with friends and some interested other people, both remotely and in person. And that brings me to TIG, which is my current project, working with one of my colleagues, Chris Payne, for a local multiplayer virtual instrument created in the Unreal 5 game engine for 3 players. A TIG is a 3-handled cup meant to be drunk from by 3 people simultaneously. And TIG has composition or planning mode, as well as a performance or improvisation mode. And it's possible to designate particular roles which can be symmetrical or asymmetrical, and almost any kind of input hardware can be used, increasing the accessibility perhaps of participation in this. And so this is very recent. This is only about a month old, so it's still very much a prototype. But in the early testing, what's been most interesting is within the simple compositional frameworks we've created as examples, that we've already got examples of both very cooperative player behavior and sort of destructive player behavior, completely unprompted. That this thing is happening in a virtual environment seems to have emphasized the extremes of behavior in a way that perhaps a more conventional multiplayer setting might not. A more physical multiplayer setting might be a better way to put it. How are we doing for time? 4 minutes. Okay, so just to give you a quick example of this, hopefully this will play. Here we can see some cooperation between players, but also this player doesn't like their idea and throws themselves purposefully off the edge so that they no longer have to participate. There's some longer videos embedded throughout. If you're interested in a particular instrument, do download the slides and have a look at those. But I really want to talk about some of the positive signs of change, that it's not just me that has recognized the importance of slowing down, that this is becoming a much wider trend. So whether it's the OMI Trust with its approach of a survey followed by a video assessment to select the most appropriate instruments for individuals before whole class ensemble teaching begins, whether it's the likes of Drake Music and the DM Lab Northwest, or Drake Music Northern Ireland, sort of getting the most out of existing designs and finding matches between players and existing instruments, whether it's the emergence of new instrument type teaching resources for performance and composition as well as for makers. I think there are a lot of signs of things shifting this way. Some of the most interesting work for me is being carried out by the Augmented Instruments Laboratory, based in London, led by Professor Andrew McPherson. And the lab not only creates augmented instruments, but also considers and builds the wider ecosystem, the hardware platforms on which things run, the implications of what it means to live with a digital musical instrument, and so on. A little bit more broadly, we've got a vast number of individuals exploring more human-friendly, DIY-compatible materials for use in instrument design, things like fabric sensors, and more sustainable materials for actuators. And we're also starting to see the third wave of human-computer interaction theory, which is concerned with individuals and culture above technology, starting to impact music technology and the NIME community in particular, and the methods that are being used, especially for evaluation. So if the future looks bright, what have I learned in 14 or 15 years or so of practice? So firstly, that I know I feel I've learned a lot from the histories of music technology. These are very rich, and there's almost certainly more that could be learned in there. There's lots still to be discovered in that respect, because of that tendency to see music technology as relatively new. We can go back a lot further than might be expected. I think one of the most important things for me is the relationship between design and the social. Not all music related design issues are social. but so many are closely intertwined with the social that we perhaps need to think more holistically. And some of the talks earlier today mentioned similar things. Some of the things you need to think about, like storing the artifacts that you've purchased or made, becomes something important. There's all kinds of social structures that impact on music technology, even down to the choice of software and hardware. I use a lot of free and open source software, but I too get the problem of IT technicians not wanting to install things. For me, different perspectives are invaluable, whether they come from collaboration or moving outside my comfort zone into a new context and applying ideas there, and then bringing back those insights back into my home domain and applying them. Above all, by moving past the creation of new things as a sort of default or first action, by slowing down, by being more frugal, we can not only get more out of the things we have in existence and exploit the advantages those things might have. Things like the turntable and turntablism and the range of techniques developed by all sorts of people for something intended for mere record playback, I think is a great example of that. But by slowing down, we also find new uses perhaps, and therefore also new users or new players. But we're better able to focus on what the new should really mean. So when we do make new things, they should do the things that we really want, rather than just making things coming to being for the sake of it. Hopefully the things we're making are really important and beneficial. I'll wrap up there, and if you've got any questions or potential collaborations or anything like that, please do get in touch. And there's quite a long bibliography if you want to do any further reading. I'll stop sharing my screen there.
That was wonderful, Matt. Thank you so much. Really interesting and rich presentation there. I love the idea of what's already out there, what's already tested, and what potentially has an incidental fit or could be adapted. We've got one question in the Q&A, which is from Nick, who's one of the conveners, one of the planners at this event. Nick's asked, saying, this is really interesting, Matt. I love the idea of taking things slower and being more thorough. Much of our sector is arguably a decade or two behind the curve in terms of experimenting and technologies and innovation. So how can we balance that deficit and pressure to catch up with the approach that you suggest?
So I think open source, whether that's specifically free Libre and open source software licenses, or things which are available under related licenses like Creative Commons, become particularly important for that. Being able to modify things is quite a useful step beyond just using things. And I think that in turn spurs a lot of thought about, now I can change things. What do I want to change? And often quite small modifications can make a significant difference. When I was the undergrad music technology course leader at Wolverhampton, one of the first things that we did was introduce open source alternatives to everything. So we had Pro Tools and we had Logic, but also we had Ardour, and students could effectively experiment. They could see under the hood, they could tweak things, and of course not everything works. You can make some changes, but particularly in software it's very easy to roll back. It's difficult to break anything, as it were. And so I think, yeah, by using those technologies where they're as good as, having them perhaps replace sort of closed commercial options, but certainly having them alongside can help sort of bridge the gap between whatever you have now and whatever the cutting edge is. Once you become curious, it becomes a lot easier to close the sorts of gaps that you might find. And sometimes you find it's quite a small gap, but it's hard to make that additional little bit of a leap. Other times it's a huge gap. But I think until you're curious and you start to sort of empower yourself, even in some small ways, it's those gaps tend to stay gaps. They don't tend to be closed.
Thank you. I do love that word curious. It's a really good word to describe much of what we should be. So I have one final question for you before we finish. I realize we're slightly over time, but it's great that people have been able to stay on. So Richard Llewellyn has asked, he said, I'd be interested to hear if any of these instruments have made it to market. Have any been commercialized so that more could engage with them? I suppose not necessarily commercialized based on what you were saying about open source, but are you aware of any of the development work that you've done or colleagues have done that has become accessible beyond the theory?
Yeah, so in terms of the new interfaces community in general, so kind of beyond my own work, the React table, which was developed by Sergi Jorda at University Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, that was commercialized and was used by Bjork, as well as a few other people. But more than that, it was influential on a whole host of multi-touch technologies. For a long time, it was the most capable multi-touch technology that had been created. So any sort of multi-touch technology of the last 10 years or so has perhaps had some influence from that. There's been examples of things like the Roly Seaboards, the Yamaha Tenorian, which have had modest impact. With my own work, so the haptic drum kit and some of the haptic technologies that underpin that are used for rehabilitation purposes now. The servo string instrument, various versions, sort of folk versions of that some people have made from the documentation themselves, sometimes with some input from me. Rolf Galhaus, sadly no longer with us. But yeah, I can think of at least 10 groups which use related versions and have kind of modded them in ways to suit themselves, which I thought was really cool. Bits of software, so even if not a whole instrument might be used, found their way into various things. So one of my PhD pieces, the sequencer for that is used by Portishead apparently. So there's all sorts of kind of strange reuses that are permitted by the licenses, and it's always surprising and quite nice to see. I'm probably forgetting some, but yeah, I think in terms of a sort of blockbuster project of this kind of work, not really yet so far, and I think that's one of the things to address. It needs the ecosystem to remain in place for long enough that people start making music. The thing needs to stay in production for long enough that enough people can access them. There needs to be the prospect for repairing them, perhaps. The ecosystem for survival is quite large, and so although the theremins still exist today to some extent, it's why a lot of interesting instruments like the Ondas Martineau, after being initially successful, have sort of slipped away. I think you can still study the Ondas Martineau at one conservatoire in Paris, but it's no longer a widely available instrument, despite having quite a lot of strengths. So it's a bit of an age-old problem.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Colleagues, I think we need to wrap up there, but thank you again, Matt, so much for your really inspiring presentation. And just to finish, I've got a few things that I've been told to say. So sadly, I've not been with you all day, but I understand that there's been a lot of conversations and content which has been really rich. and that colleagues have found it, been asking some great questions and requesting links and resources and so on. We really hope that everyone who's attended today will have found the conference useful and that will have a positive impact on their work. I'm told that the slides for all the sessions today will be shared along with other links and so on with everyone in the next few days. You already have the slides from Matt in the chat. And we need to know what you thought of the event. So please do complete the feedback survey, which Laura or Youssef will be putting a link in the chat shortly if they haven't already, and we'll be also sharing afterwards. So all it remains for me to do is to thank everyone who presented today, for all those who've joined us across the day. And I wanted to extend a particular heartfelt thanks to Time, Technology and Music Education, and to Nick, Sophie, Sarah, Richard and Rosie, who led the DIME Alliance, for putting the event together. And of course to Laura and Youssef for managing the day so well. Thank you everyone, and best wishes for the rest of the week. A week that I expect will include some searching for and exploration of technology highlighted in today's sessions, which will hopefully further support your music education practice. So thank you ever so much, everyone, and have a good rest of the day.